All right, guys, welcome back to I think this is going to be our final installment for functional anatomy this spring. Whoop, whoop. We are going to be talking and finally getting to our gait lecture. In lab, we're going to talk about the gait dysfunction. So we're going to take this time to kind of give our overview of our gait and especially the terminology and then what happens during each phase. So we have two ways or two systems of terminology, and they both pretty much mean the same. There's just one is calling it one thing and the other is calling it the other thing. But then there's also things that happen within those phases that we want to talk about. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started, right? So walking and gait, right? So what's the difference? So walking is a manner in which you move from place to place with your feet a constant state of imbalance, right? You're going from single leg stance to single leg stance to single leg stance. You're constantly kind of moving. You're not staying in static balance all at one time. The gait, on the other hand, is a process of components of walking. Okay, so the gait is how we break down those mechanics and those movements that we utilize to stay upright. Okay? We use gait to analyze, where we must first determine what joint motions occur. We'll go over that in a little bit. And then you must decide which muscles or muscle groups are acting. And that's kind of the easiest way that we can describe gait training or gait mechanics. Is first we have to see what normal gait is. Then we have to see what joint motions and evaluate what joint motions should be happening, and then what muscles are allowing those joints to move in that way. Is it a concentric contraction? Is it an eccentric contraction of whichever muscle group, which is either speeding up or slowing down or controlling or stabilizing or anything like that? So there's a multitude of things that are going on at any one time. Each person has a unique style, so that can change with mood. Usually, if we're happy, we're light and bouncy. We may kind of have some more head movement. We may have more side-to-side movement. When we're sad, we kind of maybe walk with some slumped shoulders, more heavy, more shuffling feet. Okay? And this is the big point, this point down at the bottom. Walking requires balancing on one leg while the other leg moves forward. So if we just look at ambulation or gait or walking in that sense, that is a series of single leg stance where you are stabilized on one leg and you are moving the other leg. It gets to be pretty complex. Okay? And if we have people who have some type of neurologic deficit, some type of muscular weakness, some type of cognitive or upper motor neuron or whatever type of pathology that we've talked about this semester, okay, it can drastically affect those mechanics and the person's ability to do those things. Okay. So the gait cycle goes step all the way through swing and then into another step. So it's kind of heel stride to heel strike. So that's stride length. So cadence is the walking speed. How fast are you going? It's usually measured in steps taken per minute, and it can vary. Slow is around 70 steps per minute. Fast is usually 130. Once you get past 130, you start incorporating some flight phase, and then it's no longer kind of walking, it's more running. So stance phase, you've heard me already say that term before. Stance phase is the activity that begins when the foot is in contact with the ground, and it begins with the heel strike or initial contact of one foot, and it ends when that foot leaves the ground, either terminal stance or toe off, where we begin the swing phase. So roughly 60% of our gait cycle. On the other hand, swing phase, that's when the foot is not in contact with the ground. Begins as soon as the foot leaves the floor, and it ends when the heel of the same foot touches the floor again. When we're walking, we have what's called double support, and that's when both feet are in contact with the ground at the same time. One foot is in initial contact, while the other foot is in terminal stance. And they kind of do a reverse. That occurs twice in a single gait cycle in about less than 10%. The faster you walk, the less double limb support. Whoop. All right, so single support, only one foot is in contact with the ground. That is during our stance phase. There's 2 periods of that in a gait cycle. Non-support occurs only during running. I call it the flight phase, okay? Whether neither foot is in contact with the ground. If you've ever seen like a running antelope or a leopard or something like that, the cool shot that photographers like to get is with all of their feet up off the ground. Call the flight. It's your book calls it non-support. I call it flight phase because it sounds cooler. No, just kidding. It does sound cooler, but that's not the reason. And this just goes into it. So gait cycle is a stance phase and a full swing phase. So it goes from initial contact, stance phase, into swing phase, and then ends with the initial contact or heel contact of the same foot. Sorry, dog was looking. And you can see that there's a double limb support at the beginning, at the middle, and then it ends. All right, so 3 tasks. We need to get weight on the foot. We need to stabilize that single leg support, and then we need to be able to advance that leg forward, or the swing phase forward, the swing leg weight forward. So weight acceptance, that's when the foot initial contacts the ground. That's when you're in double limb support and you need to get your weight over onto one side, stabilized, so that then we can move the other leg forward. Single leg support is where the body weight shifts completely onto the stance leg, and then that leg advancement is during swing phase where the opposite leg of the stance leg swings forward. All right, so we talked about earlier how there's two systems of terminology, if you will. There's a traditional, and then there's a ranchos los amigos. Each one, stance, when we're talking about stance, has 5 phases. So the traditional gait terminology has a heel strike, a flat foot, or a foot flat, mid stance, heel off, toe off. Okay. So that heel strike is right when that foot comes in contact with the ground. It comes in, boom, heel strike. And the next thing, that foot falls forward, kind of becomes in contact with the ground. We go into rear foot valgus. That's flat foot. Then our tibia kind of rotates forward, and then it's over kind of right perpendicular to the ground. That's going to be mid stance. Then once that tibia rolls forward enough, it's going to raise that heel off the ground. Okay, that's heel off. And then toe off is when we're rotating over those toes and they come off. Okay? That's toe off. And so it gives terminology to the observations that you've probably already seen. You've probably heard of heel strike in mid stance before. Those other ones, the foot flat, heel off, toe off, those are kind of the in-betweeners. Right. So at heel strike, go ahead and start looking at this now. During heel strike, between heel strike and foot flat, what happens? Okay. The foot eccentrically plantar flexes. The tibia rotates forward. We get a little bit of bend in our knee. During mid stance, not too much happening at our ankles. Okay. Our tibia is rotated more forwards. It's probably controlled reversal muscle action from our gastroc and soleus. Our knee is more an extension. And as we move forward, we're getting into more anterior tibial translation, which is going to bring the heel off, and that foot's going to come off in preparation for swing phase. So what do we think muscle-wise? What do we think muscle-wise is going to happen between heel strike and flat foot? What do we think is going to be happening muscle-wise as that foot leaves the ground? We are completely in mid-stance. What's going on at the hip? Okay. Some questions to ask ourselves. The other type of terminology is going to be that Ranchos Los Amigos. It's a gait laboratory at the Ranchos Los Amigos Medical Center. Right? And it kind of refers to periods, whereas the traditional terms refer to points in time. The Ranchos Los Amigos is going to refer to periods. So you're going to see that the Ranchos Los Amigos system utilizes a beginning and an end. Right. So initial heel contact, same as heel contact. Where the heel comes in contact with the ground. Hopefully, we are in rear foot varus to lock out the foot. Then we get into loading response. Just like with our traditional, it's going to be where that foot is coming in and that foot is lowering down to the ground to get to flat foot, foot flat, flat foot, foot flat, whatever. Just after initial contact, when the body weight is being transferred onto the leg and the entire foot makes contact with the ground. And it ends with the opposite foot leaves the ground as that tibia is now rotating forward to be right on top of the foot. Mid stance is beginning after the ending, or the opposite foot leaves the ground. And then it ends when the body is directly over the weight-bearing limb. So that's going to be end of mid stance, about there. And then terminal stance is going to go from there until it ends with initial contact to the opposite leg where the body has moved in front of the weight-bearing leg. So my body is up here. It's now going to move in front of that leg. And then pre-swing is going to be as the foot kind of starts to raise up. So shifting into the swing phase, traditional, we have acceleration, mid-swing, and deceleration. Ooh, deceleration. That's a good one. Think deceleration, we think eccentric contraction. Acceleration, we should be thinking concentric contraction. So acceleration, the swing leg begins to move forward. We're concentrically contracting our hip flexors, our knee extenders, our knee flexors. Mid-swing, the swing or non-weight bearing leg is directly under the body, and in deceleration, the leg is slowing down in preparation for heel strike. So those hip extensors are firing eccentrically. The knee flexors are firing eccentrically to slow down the extension, keeping it from snapping into place. With Ranchos Los Amigos, again, remember we're looking at periods of time, not just intervals. So initial swing begins when the toes leave the ground. That makes sense. And it ends when the swing foot is opposite the weight-bearing foot, or in parallel with each other. So mid-swing is when the swing is on opposite of the weight-bearing foot, and ends when the swing leg has moved in front of the body. So that's a pretty brief little period. That's going from, if my fingers are my legs, swing or mid-swing is from here to about here. Right? Very short. And terminal swing is when the tibia is in a vertical position and it ends just prior to initial contact. We don't spend a lot of time talking about swing. The main thing that we're worried about during swing is clearing the toe. Getting that leg forward without catching your toe and tripping down the steps. So analysis of stance phases. Stance is in the period in which the foot is in contact with the floor. We know this. 5 components: heel strike, foot flat, mid stance, heel off, toe off. So heel strike, the moment the heel comes in contact with the ground. Ankle is in a neutral position. Ankle is in neutral as far as dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. We should be in rear foot varus. Knee begins to flex, which provides some shock absorption as the foot hits the ground. And the hip is in roughly 25 degrees of hip flexion. Trunk is hopefully erect. Hopefully we are not bent over. And trunk is rotated toward the opposite side, right? So if we are taking a step with our right foot, okay, my pelvis is now rotated towards my left. Right? So if I'm taking a step with my right, my pelvis that kind of bridges the two, it is in relative left rotation. Hopefully that was on the screen. I just made a thing with my hands. Hopefully you saw. Opposite arm is forward to counteract that right rotation. And same side arm is back in hyperextension, or extension as we call it. And the body weight begins to shift onto the stance leg. All right, so let's look at what is going on, especially in our lower extremities. Okay, so in heel strike or in our ranchos los amigos, our initial contact, okay, those hip extensors are beginning to contract eccentrically to slow the hip from going into any further flexion, because we want that foot to hit the ground and we don't want that hip to keep going forward. Our quads switch to eccentric to slow down the knee flexion because we're getting weight onto that foot. Ankles in neutral between dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, and the knee begins to flex. This allows for some shock absorption, and the hip is in roughly 25 degrees. So our ankle dorsiflexors and heel strike are active in putting an ankle in a neutral position. Quadriceps contract eccentrically to minimize the amount of knee flexion as a shock absorber. Our hip flexors are active, meaning they're firing, and our hip extensors are beginning to contract to keep the hip from flexing. And our erector spine A is active in keeping the trunk from flexing. It's kind of like we hit the ground. We don't want our trunk to fall forward because that would be bad. So our trunk extensors fire, kind of like we talked about during our hippotherapy video that we saw, right? Foot hits the ground, it's going to be a little bit of a deceleration moment. And if our trunk erectors weren't kicked in, it would kick us forward, and that would be bad. So foot flat, or the loading response, the entire foot is in contact with the ground, occurs shortly after heel strike. Obviously, it's the next phase. Our ankle moves into 15 degrees of plantar flexion. Does it do it actively, concentrically, or does it do it eccentrically? We are going to be eccentric. Circle this, star this right out to the side. If that happens and our dorsiflexors aren't firing well, or they're tired, maybe we're in mile 6 of our walk and our tibialis anterior is just too tired to help. Okay? That foot's going to slap down, called foot slap. Okay. Big indicator of anterior shin splints. During foot flat or loading response, the knee moves into 20 degrees of flexion. The hip is moving into extension because our body is now moving over a fixed surface after our heel hits the ground. Ooh, baby. And our weight shifts onto the stance leg continues. 15 degrees of plantar flexion eccentrically. You could write eccentrically out here. Hip is moving into extension, kind of a passive way. I mean, it's going to be stabilized laterally, but it's not by any means a concentric contraction, not yet. The rest of the body will catch up. Mid stance, the body passes over the weight-bearing foot, and our ankle moves into slight dorsiflexion. Our dorsiflexors are inactive, and our plantar flexors contract, controlling the rate at which the leg moves over the ankle. And so we are going into dorsiflexion, but our plantar flexors are active, means it's an eccentric contraction to slow us down. Hip and knee continue to extend. You could say that those are both concentrics now, because as our body is catching up to our foot, now we're going to start to get into that propulsion phase, and that's going to come from our hip. That's going to come from going into hip extension. Our trunk is in neutral position because our two legs are even. Hip is in extension Concentrically, our glutes are firing, pulling our body over our foot. Our knees are in full extension, so those are contracting to stabilize and keep us there. And our plantar flexors are controlling movement over our ankle in an eccentric fashion. And then heel off or terminal stance, the heel rises off the floor. Our ankle will dorsiflex to about 15 degrees and then begin to plantar flex as we are being more propelled forward. Knee is nearly into full extension. Hip is in hyperextension because our body is now way forward over our leg. Our trunk has begun to rotate to the same side because remember, while this foot is in terminal stance, this foot is now starting to get ready for that loading response or that initial contact. So our pelvis is now facing the same side of our stance. Okay? So at initial contact, boom, we're in contralateral pelvic rotation. During terminal stance, we're in ipsilateral pelvic rotation. My dog's going to throw up. I hope not. No. Okay. We're not throwing up. It's good. So heel rises off the floor. We're now going into plantar flexion. And we're in our max dorsiflexion phase. And then to begin plantar flexion push off propulsion, we will need our plantar flexors or our gastroc and soleus to contract concentrically to propel us forward in addition to our hip. Our knee is nearly in full extension. And then during toe off, our ankles move into 10 degrees of plantar flexion. So instead of being in that dorsiflexion phase, right, now we are in plantar flexion because our plantar flexors are now pushing us forward in the lateral plane. Knees and hips are now flexing, and our thighs perpendicular to the ground. So even before that foot comes off the ground, that knee is now flexed. This is because we can flex the knee now because we are in double stance. Okay. So the RLA or the Ranchos Los Amigos description shows it really nicely how we're going from heel off to initial contact on our contralateral foot. So non-weight bearing activities are our swing phase, acceleration, mid-swing, and deceleration, and our traditional, and then initial swing, mid-swing, and terminal swing in our Ranchos Los Amigos. So that's just talking about what we're doing. All right. So acceleration or initial swing, the leg is behind the body, moving to catch up. Our ankle is dorsiflexing to clear the toe. And knee and hip continue to flex. So this is all concentric. All concentric. Nothing eccentric is happening. Our ankle dorsiflexors, our tibialis anterior, is concentrically contraction to pull our toes up so we can clear the foot. Same with our hip and knee. They are flexing to move the leg forward and to clear the toe. Remember, on the left is our traditional, on the right is our Ranchos Los Amigos. Dorsiflexion, knee and hip are flexing. Hip is flexing to advance the leg. Knee is flexing to clear the toe. Ankle is dorsiflexing to help clear the toe as well. During mid-swing, our ankle dorsiflexors put the ankle in a more neutral position. Our knee is at roughly 65 degrees, and hip are at roughly 25 degrees. Our inflection, and this shortens the leg, allows the foot to clear. Once that hip gets greater than 25 degrees, it moves the leg in front of the body and puts the lower leg in a vertical position to get us ready for our deceleration phase. And then after that, we get our initial contact. Okay, so we are still concentrically contracting everything at this point. During terminal swing or deceleration, our ankle dorsiflexors are active to keep the ankle in neutral position. Our knee is extending, and the hamstrings, circle this, outline this. Our hamstrings are contracting eccentrically to slow down the leg. I want you to kind of take a little note and remember this for when we start talking about above knee amputations. Okay? Because we can passively extend that knee, but without hamstrings, there's no way to slow it down. Keeps it from snapping. That eccentric contraction of the hamstrings keeps the knee from snapping into hyperextension. The leg has swung forward as far as it will go, and the hip remains in flexion. We are getting ready for our loading response. We're coming in for landing. Additional determinants of gait, we have a vertical displacement, and we have a horizontal displacement. Right? Vertical displacement, that just means that as we walk, we bob a little bit. Everybody does it. It's normal. Normal is about 2 inches. If you're getting more than that, now you're pushing off your foot a little bit more. Little kids tend to have a higher vertical displacement. Marshall has a little bit of an issue with being a toe walker. We're always yelling at him to get off his toes. Okay, but he'll kind of bop a little bit. He'll bounce off of his toes. Horizontal displacement, again, that line's going to kind of shift as you weight shifts from side to side. That's roughly 2 inches. If that's more than 2 inches, that means that we have some lateral instability. That's about vertical displacement, and then that horizontal displacement, normally about 2 to 4 inches. You don't want it so that your feet are right in line, but you don't want it so that your feet are too wide. Babies have a very waddling gait. Not babies, but like first-time walkers, new walkers. This gait is going to be really wide. Also, elderly, if they're really unstable, will have a wide base of support as well. So the old adage is kind of all the motor patterns that we see in our little kids when they're first learning things eventually get regressed to later in life as we become older and older. The width of the walking base usually is going to be 2 to 4 inches apart. Our lateral pelvic tilt is normal. Okay, normal. There's a normal amount. You're going to drop that hip a little bit. When it becomes excessive, when it's like snapping down and across, okay, that's when it becomes an issue, and that's when we call it Trendelenburg gait pattern. And that is our ipsilateral hip abductors and our contralateral QL and erector spinae. This paragraph talks about this hip. It's referring to this hip. When I talk about things, I usually talk about the weight bearing or the stance leg. That's usually my point of reference. This paragraph is talking about the non-weight bearing, so don't let that confuse you. Because it says the opposite side referring to the weight bearing side. So we also have a step length. They should be equal in both distance and time. There's no set standard because everybody has different step length. Okay? I'm 5'11". Griffin is 3.5 feet. Yeah, he's 42, 44 inches. 46 inches. Okay. my stride length is going to be exceptionally larger than his. If you've ever looked at little kids walking in like the supermarket or the mall or wherever with their moms or dads or whatever, mom and dad seem to be walking at a normal speed, and the little kids seem to be running to keep up because their stride lengths are so much less. Arms should swing in the opposite direction of the leg. So if I take a step with my left foot, my right arm should move forward. And the trunk rotates forward as the leg progresses through swing phase. Okay? So if I'm taking a step with my left, if I'm swinging with my left, I have a right pelvic rotation. So when we're analyzing gait, we're going to view it from the side. We're going to look at stride length, upper extremity swing, head and trunk position. What's going on at the lower extremities? Are they operating in the right fashion that we expect them to? We're going to view it from the back. We're going to look at the width of the walking base. Does that lateral pelvis shift? Does it drop too much? And the position of the shoulders and head. Our young children, like we've talked about, are going to walk with a wider base. Their cadence is going to be faster, usually to keep up with us bigger people. Stride length is going to be shorter because they have shorter little legs. Initial contact is with a flat foot, no heel strike. Or if you're like my son Marshall, he has more of a 4-foot strike. We're trying to get him to be more heely, but that will come. Okay. Little or no, young little kids don't have little or no reciprocal arm swing. Kind of contrary, or kind of look at that and compare it to our older adults. Our older adults walk slower. They spend more time in stance phase. They take shorter steps. Their vertical displacement is less. They may walk with a wider base and have a greater horizontal displacement. Looks kind of similar, okay? Walk with a wider base. Kind of similar. Shorter steps. All right, so we're going to talk about the dysfunctional gait patterns in lab. So we are going to end it here, and then we will pick up talking about and demonstrating and talking about all the dysfunction that we'll see. We'll look at each other's gait. We'll look at some videos all during lab time. So hope you have enjoyed it. Again, as always, if you have questions, please write it down, and we will get to them in lab, or you can shoot me an email if you don't quite understand anything. But do we all really understand anything?